Hello and welcome, my name is Shadow Retro, and in my recent tier list video I showed off my Saryn build doing this. And I had someone in my comment section asking how I did this and if I would show off my build. So I was more than happy to oblige, and I am here creating this video showcasing exactly how I just did that. And in case you weren't sure, those were level 180 enemies. And I'll do it again for prosperity if you wish. But before we get into showing off the build, I will first explain Saryn's kit so you can get to know how she works and how she plays. And I will also give you some tips on how to play her, and then we'll get into the build after that. So, starting off with Saryn's passive. Saryn's passive on another Warframe would kind of be a bit useless, but honestly it does kind of make sense with Saryn's kit. Pretty much the only thing the passive does is increase the duration of status effects by 25%, applied by both her weapons and abilities. And this is an additive buff with mods as well. So again, nothing crazy, but her abilities are kind of based around applying different status effects, so it does kind of synergize well with her kit. Saryn's first ability is called Spores. Casting spores will target a single target and create a spore on them. Shooting at the spore will then have it explode, inflicting all enemies within a set radius, scaling of range, with the same spores. The spores will deal corrosive damage over time for every spore that is inflicted on the enemies. And when you explode one spore on an enemy, you'll notice that it will not only spread the spores to all new enemies, but it will also create a second instance of the spore on the original enemy. And enemies can be inflicted with at most of 3 spores, and each spore has its own damage over time. You'll also notice that the damage over time has a 50% status chance to apply the corrosive status effect, allowing you to armor strip enemies by 80% or fully stripping them if you have 2 green shards. The damage of the ability will do a set amount of damage on its initial cast, which scales with strength, but as the ability is activated, it will continuously increase over time. As you can see in my bottom right, I have a unique icon that shows me exactly how much damage the ability does, and it will continuously increase over time, more and more and more, as long as there is at least one enemy currently inflicted with the spores. When the ability is no longer inflicted upon any enemy, the icon will instead show that it is decaying with a flashing red decay button. You can simply reactivate the ability on an enemy to stop it from decaying, and it will then start to go up once again. If the ability fully decays to its base damage over time, the icon will disappear. Casting the ability on an enemy while the ability is already activated will lower your stored damage over time by a tiny bit, but it will also decrease the cost of the ability by 50%. Additionally, while you can only have up to 3 spores on a single enemy spread from the spore explosion, casting the ability will allow you to place up to 12 spores on a single enemy. This ability has 2 augments. The first augment will simply just make enemies that are currently inflicted by the spores show up on the minimap within 40 meters. Not very useful. The second ability, however, allows you to hold down the ability cast and give yourself a corrosive damage buff, as well as any other allies that was in roof range. This corrosive damage buff is for your weapons, and it does not mix with any modded electricity or heat on your weapon, meaning you can have electric or toxic, meaning you can have toxic and corrosive or electric and corrosive. Saryn's second ability is called Molt. Casting the ability will summon a Molt where she was standing. The Molt will draw enemies' fire, cleanse Saryn of any negative status effects currently inflicted on her, and also increase her movement speed for a short duration. The Molt will be immune to all damage for a set time when it is initially cast, and all damage that it receives during this time will be added to its health bar. If you recast the ability runs out of health, or the ability runs out of duration, it will explode, dealing toxic damage to all enemies within the area. The augment for this ability makes it so that Saryn will get some health regen over time for a short duration after casting the ability. Molt has basically no animation time, does not interrupt any maneuvers like parkour, shooting your weapon, or reloading your weapon, making it perfect for shield getting. Toxic Lash is Saryn's third ability, and it is probably the most overpowered broken ability in this entire game. A lot of people probably don't truly understand how Toxic Lash works, as the way it reads is it's just a toxic damage buff applied to your weapons, except it is so much more than just that. So, it isn't actually a toxic damage buff that is given to your weapons, like say the corrosive damage buff that Saryn gets from her first ability, Augment. What it actually is like how Zarta's Whisper works. It is a second damage instance. For example, I just have a regular unmodded weapon here. You'll see that it does 1 damage number. You can see the white 18. If I now cast my Toxic Lash, when I shoot the ability now, you'll see the 2 damage numbers. Not only will you see the white number, which is the damage of the actual ability, and you'll also see the Toxic Lash number. And it doesn't just trigger once of each shot, it triggers each time off multi-shot. Because Toxic Lash activates on every damage instance of the weapon, effectively doubling your multi-shot. Because of this, the way it scales is a bit different. It scales off both ability strength and the mods on your weapon. As the way it works is it does as the damage that Toxic Lash does is a percentage of your weapon's damage. And obviously, the percentage is increased with strength. It scales off base damage mod, crit damage mods, and it will also scale off toxic mods particularly well. In fact, Toxic Lash has a force proc, meaning it will always apply the toxic status effect on every hit. And although it is a second damage instance, the toxic status effect that is applied by Toxic Lash will factor in the toxic damage from any toxic mods you have on the weapon, even if that toxic mod is currently being used to mix with another element like corrosive, viral, or gas. Since Toxic Lash scales off the damage of your ability, it also factors in other ability buffs. For example, Toxic Lash will scale with Venom Dose, which is the augment for Saryn's first ability that gives her extra corrosive. And so Venom Dose will not only increase the damage your weapon does, but it will also increase the damage that Toxic Lash does. Toxic Lash also double dips with faction mods. What this means is that the faction mod will apply once to the weapon itself, and then when the damage of Toxic Lash is calculated, it will factor in a second time. And since Toxic Lash force procs the toxic status effect, and status effects normally just double dip with faction mods anyway, the toxic status effect applied by Toxic Lash will triple dip with faction mods, meaning the faction mod will affect the original weapon source, then affect Toxic Lash, and then a third time it will affect the status effect. And each time it affects it is multiplicative. If you use Toxic Lash with Melee Influence also triple dips with faction mods. So, with using Toxic Lash on it, it quadruple dips with faction mods. Meaning, it will apply once to the weapon, once to the Toxic Lash, once to the original status effect, and then a fourth time to the spread status effects applied through through Melee Influence. In fact, the damage that Toxic Lash does is actually doubled on melee weapons. And it gets better. Normally, on every single Warframe in the game, they can only have 1 damage buff. What I mean by this is if you attempted to mod Raw on Zaku, you could only put it over Zarta's Whisper. Or if you wanted to put clips on Chroma, you could only put it on Vex Armor. You can only have 1 damage buff on the single Warframe. For some reason, Saryn is not limited by this, because Saryn can have Eclipse, Zarta's Whisper, or the faction damage buff that is Raw, in addition to Toxic Lash. And do remember that Toxic Lash triple dips with faction damage. Additionally, normally with spores, you would need to actually attack the spore itself to make it explode to spread the spores. But Toxic Lash makes it so that no matter where you hit the enemy on their body, it will cause the explosion, making it much easier to spread spores. And lastly, there is a Archon Shard in this game that increases the damage of the toxic status effect by 30%. And you can have 5 of them, and you can have Tower Forged ones, which is 45% per shard. It is ridiculously powerful. The augment for this ability will create a toxic cloud behind whenever you kill an enemy. This cloud will permeate, meaning it will linger on the field after the death of the enemy, and any enemy that is within range of the cloud will take toxic damage over time. And the damage will be doubled if you kill the enemy with a melee. Honestly, this is actually a pretty decent augment, but because Toxic Lash does so much ridiculous amounts of damage already, and by extension Saryn, you really don't need to ever use it. Saryn's 4th ability is her Letdown ability. Her 4th ability is just a 4 AoE ability that stuns enemies and does some viral damage to them. It does Force proc viral, so every enemy inflicted with the ability will receive viral and also have a bit of a damage over time placed on them. But it doesn't really do basically any damage, as you just saw. It is good for low level nuking, but in high levels it just doesn't really cut out for it. However, if you use the ability on enemies currently infected by spores, the damage it does will be increased by 400%. But as you can see, it's still not that big of a damage difference. It's just not that good of an ability to begin with. So this build, how does it work and what are we doing? Well, the build is extremely simple. We are using Venom Dose, Saryn's augment, for her first ability, because while Saryn's first ability can be very powerful and do a lot of damage, she just does so much ridiculous amounts of damage these days that her first ability can't keep up with her. But we can use Venom Dose to not only increase the damage we are doing, but also to increase the damage Toxic Lash does. Then we are also using Roar, which will not only increase the damage of Toxic Lash, but triple dip with it. And since we are using our melee weapon with melee influence, those melee influence procs will quadruple dip with Roar. And the melee weapon we are using is the dual Ichor Incarnate, which will leave behind toxic clouds, which will deal toxic damage over time to enemies after they die. And these toxic clouds are affected by base damage mods, not including Condition Overload, as well as toxic elemental buffs, including Toxic Lash. So Toxic Lash will increase the damage that the toxic status effects that the toxic clouds created upon enemies' deaths from dual Ichors to make it do even more damage. So a few tips on how to play her. Really, there's not really a lot you need to know about Saryn. You just activate your abilities, you'll hold cast your first, activate Toxic Lash, activate Roar, and you just literally cut through enemies as if they're paper. It is really not that hard. But the one thing that you might struggle with Saryn is survivability. She is widely considered a glass cannon, that is to say she does a lot of damage, but she doesn't have much survivability. However, what people mostly do with her is shield gating. This is because, as I mentioned, Molt has literally no animation time and doesn't affect your gameplay in any way. It doesn't prevent you from reloading, firing, parkouring, or anything like that. And it also cleanses you of negative status effects. And it also gives you crowd control, making it honestly a very good tool for shield gating. However, while you probably want to be doing that in high level content, for base Steel Path, you really don't need to do that, and you could make a tank setup with her. For a health tank setup, you can just use Adaptation and Arcane Blessing, and you can get healing from her second ability augment, or you can even use green shards to heal her as well. Or you can do what I'm doing, which is a shield tank setup synergized with a specific companion, which gives me additional support when it comes to survivability with shields, which I'll obviously explain when we get to it in the build section. Speaking of the builds, let's talk about Archon Shards. So I do have 2 green emerald shards to increase the amount of corrosive status effects I can apply. 14 corrosive status effects allow me to fully strip with corrosive status effect. However, honestly, these days you don't really need this because she kills enemies so fast, she doesn't even have time to apply enough corrosive status effects. Anyway, it is important to note though that you will be applying corrosive status effects with melee influence through your melee because of Venom Dose. It will give you the corrosive damage type, so it is still quite useful for the full strip if need be. In addition to that, the other 2 green shards I have, both Tower Forged, increase the damage of our status effects by 45%. This is incredibly overkill. You do not need it. However, if you're like me and you want to just destroy enemies within milliseconds, and you want to do just stupid amounts of damage, then don't stop with just 2. Get a 3rd Tower Forged green shard and get the extra damage to the toxic status effect, because why not? But if you're looking for a cheaper setup and don't want to spend all the Archon Shards on her, you don't need to use them, so don't worry about it. For the actual Saryn build, I just put on any Mora at all. I didn't care about it. It's not doing anything for the build. You can put on whatever you want. We are using Primed Redirection along with Fast Reflection and Arcane Aegis for the shield tanking setup. Primed Redirection obviously increases the amount of shields we have. Fast Reflection increases how fast our shields regenerate, as well as reducing the shield delay rate, making it so it will recharge faster whenever it takes damage. And Arcane Aegis, when triggered, will also give us that increased shield regen, which will also regen even when we're taking damage for that extra survivability. Our other arcane is Arcane Strike, which will give us additional attack speed for our melee, allowing us to attack really fast and apply even more status effect, ripping through enemies like they're nothing. We are also using Adaptation for the extra damage reduction for the shield tanking setup, and we do obviously have Venom Dose for the damage buff from her first ability. Besides that, we are just using Blind Range and Umber Intensify for the ability strength, Primed Continuity for the ability duration, and Equilibrium for some energy economy, as we're not using Primed Flow or anything like that. Honestly, the build is extremely light on energy because it is a weapon platform setup and the abilities all have very long duration. 46 seconds for Roar, 69 for Toxic Lash, and 62 duration for Venom Dose. So we don't need to cast abilities very often, and you honestly don't even need Equilibrium. This is a bit more of a flex slot, so it's up to you. The build is super flexible, don't have to do much. She's just ridiculously powerful, whatever you do, really. For the Dual Ichor Incarnants, for the first evolution, I am using this one, which will increase the base damage of the weapon. Which will increase the base damage of the weapon, and also gives me 5 additional combo on whenever I target an enemy infected with Toxic. And you will remember that Toxic Lash force procs the Toxic status effect. So I'll just show you just how quickly I build combo with this theme, with this evolution. So as you can see, I have no combo right now. 6 times. I'm now at max combo. And now they're all dead. And that was just with Toxic Lash, by the way. I didn't activate Raw or Venom Dose. The second evolution here will just increase the range of the ability, which means I'm hitting more enemies, spreading more status effects with melee influence, and doing more damage overall. And lastly, we will also be increasing the status chance of the weapon with that flat number, giving it even more status chance, which means even more status priming, more status effects being spread by Dual Ichors for even more damage. The Dual Ichor setup is a very, very basic Viral Electric melee influence setup, meaning we get Viral from the Dual Ichors, Toxic from Toxic Lash, Electric from Dual Ichors, and Corrosive from Venom Dose. Obviously, we have melee influence, we have whatever stance you want. Condition Overload for our base damage, Galvanized Steel for our crit damage, not our crit chance, as it does give more crit damage than Organ Shadow. Blood Rush for the crit chance, though obviously Galvanized Steel does give us the extra crit chance. Berserker Fury for the attack speed, Weeping Runes for the status chance, our unranked viral mods for the viral priming, and obviously the electric to trigger melee influence. For the companion, I am using the Taxon. This is because of this precept right here, which will give me some, which will have the Taxon attack enemies and give me some shields based on the damage it does. In addition to this, I'm also running Shield Charger, which will increase the amount of max shields I have, increasing my shield get duration, and also increasing my shield regeneration speed. And then obviously Guardian, which will fully restore my shields once and then go on cooldown if it fully depletes. These 3 mods together give me a ton of tankiness to my shields, as they help a lot when it comes to continuously regenerating my shields, giving me as much tankiness and healing with my shields as I need be. Benefit Bond is obviously used to reduce the cooldown for all 3 mods. Momentumous Bond is there to reduce the respawn timer of Taxon, as each time we kill an Xmas unit, the respawn timer will be lowered by 18 seconds. Since Deconstruct will make it so that enemies that are tagged by the enemy will have an increased chance to drop health orbs. We have Calculated Redirection and Enhanced Vitality for the survivability, Assault mode to make it so the companion can actually attack enemies, and then Vacuum is a must-have mod. The weapon we are using is the Taziko, as it is the best weapon in the Sentinel weapon in the game when it comes to priming. It is a chaining beam gun with a relatively good status chance, which makes it extremely good for priming. We are using Fast Reload for the reload speed, Rough Aptitude for the status chance, Primed Shred for the punch through and fire rate, and Split Chamber for the multi-shot. Everything else is just our elements we want from the weapon. Taziko has Inherent Electricity, we are giving it Radiation for Radiation Reload, Malignant Force and Rim Rounds gives us Viral, and then we have our new Magnetic Capacity, the new Magnetic boss, our mod from the new update, which also gives us Magnetic, meaning we will stun enemies with Electric, crowd control them with Radiation, making it turn on each other, and make their Overguard, shields, and health weaker to damage with Magnetic and Viral. For the utility weapons, for the secondary and primary, you can run whatever you want. However, I do highly recommend running Amalgam Serration on the rifle for increased movement speed, as well as running primary Dexterity for the extra combo duration at max rank. For the secondary, I would recommend running Amalgam Barrel Diffusion for the extra rolling speed, the 2 Augur mods, Augur Seeker and Augur Pact, for the energy to shield conversion for some additional survivability, and obviously secondary Dexterity for the additional combo duration. And for the focus skill, we are obviously running Naramon for the Power Strike effect, which will make it so that whenever our combo duration does run out, instead of being reduced by instead of losing our entire combo stack, we only lose 5 combo per time. Anyway, that is the build. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was helpful for you to understand Saryn a bit more and how she works, and understand why she's just ridiculously overpowered. And anyway, if you enjoyed this video, do check out some of my other stuff. Leave any comment for recommendations of videos you would like to see in the future, or leave a comment on anything else you would want. Give me a like, give me a subscribe, and until next time, bye bye.